presidents, CEO of NASDAQ, director of the World Economic Forum USA, designer of cybersecurity for the nation's financial realm. If you have a full, free afternoon, you might possibly be able to read through Al Berkeley's list of accomplishments. But what you're going to learn from this gentleman today is the true value of money. Al Berkeley knows what investment in the right hands can accomplish for the benefit of all humanity. And add to that, Al's masterful power to make sure that ample amounts do get into the right hands. I invite you to listen to Mr. Alfred Berkeley and discover the most powerful method of investment.
Well, Bart, I hope I can live up to that introduction, and I'm delighted to be here. I'm losing my voice a bit, so I hope you can hear me with the microphone. I thought I'd tell you a little bit about Princeton Capital Management's journey to partnering with one of the UN-affiliated organizations and what we're trying to accomplish. Princeton Capital is an investment management firm, has mainly wealthy families and individuals as clients, and we just sort of perked along as a money management firm, didn't think much about the UN or any of the UN's programs. But over the years, I had been going to the World Economic Forum in Davos in January and had met two remarkable men, one a fellow named Roland Schatz, who runs a media analysis company in Vienna. He tracks what is said in thought leadership journals and newspapers and TV shows and radio shows, and can tell you where an idea starts in the world and who speaks for it and who speaks against it. The company's called Media Tenor. If I see some notes being taken. And he introduced me to another interesting man, a man named Michael Moeller. And over the 19 years that Michael and I were at Davos together, Michael kept getting promoted in the United Nations and ended up being the chief operating officer in Geneva. Well, they reached out to me about 2 years ago and said, we would like you to create a stock index, not unlike the NASDAQ 100, that tracks companies around the world, that contains companies around the world that are committed to the Sustainable Development Goals. Could I see a show of hands if you know what the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations are? Well, let me take just a minute and explain it. You may remember in 2000 there were a lot of hoopla in launching the Millennial Development Goals. The Millennial Development Goals were very high-minded goals: clean air, no poverty, gender equality, about a dozen of them. They went nowhere. In 2015, when they were supposed to be coming to fruition, there was a working group put together at the United Nations by Michael Moeller, who said, how did we mess that up so badly? What did we do wrong? And they had an insight that I think is a powerful insight, and that is, on the one hand, they must try again, that these issues were too important not to just keep working on. The second insight they had was that the Millennial Development Goals were the agreement and the signature and the tasking of nation states to get change made. And they realized that nation states are policy wonks, that it's not where work gets done. The Sustainable Development Goals, the second effort, of which there are 17 goals and 169 targets under them, is aimed at cities. It's cities where people live, not nation states. It's city politicians who fix potholes, who get water clean, who are in a position to implement the issues around poverty or gender equality or any of the other 17 goals. And this is it sounds so simple, but it was a profound insight of how you actually get change done, particularly in these Western democracies, where there's no central command and control. Well, democracies are a very interesting beast. You know, there are about 195 countries in the world. There are about a dozen of them that are pretty robust democracies. There are about a dozen of them that are just horrible dictatorships. And then in the middle, you've got this broad spread of good and bad mixed in that make things very difficult to get done. So what we did is I said to Michael Moeller and to Roland Schatz, I said, you know, I can build you an index around these companies that are hewing to the Sustainable Development Goals, but why don't you just go to the NASDAQ? The NASDAQ has an index engine there. And basically they said, well, we've already talked to all of the people that create indices in the stock market, and they want to subordinate our brand to theirs. So there's the politics of branding entered in it. And I said, well, I'll help you with this. And as I dug into it, I realized it was a much more difficult problem than the NASDAQ 100 index, which is entirely quantitative. A company that is in the NASDAQ 100 index is in it, and the index is dependent on its stock price. So it goes up and down with the collective movement of the companies that are in that index. Taking on the Sustainable Development Goals gets you a dimension that's quantitative, but also gets you a dimension that's qualitative. One person's good is another person's bad. How do you interpret the issues in the 17 goals that are based on compassion as opposed to being based on physics like carbon footprints? So there's all this trade-off that's going on. We've been helping the UNGSII Global Sustainability Index Institute, which is a nonprofit set up outside the UN by UN officers so that it can criticize. One of the really interesting problems with the United Nations is it can't stop any initiative that it starts because you get all these countries getting jobs and development money from them. There are about 52 or 53 UN-related organizations, but most of them, very few of them are funded through dues. Most of them are funded like UNICEF of having to go out and raise money from the public, so that there's a huge charitable donation issue there. Well, UNGSII was set up to be able to call out not only the good things that were happening, but the bad things that were happening. And you can't do that inside the United Nations because of the protocols of everybody being more or less equal. And particularly if you criticize a large player, they just hold their dues back, and that puts the UN in a very tenuous position. Well, we've been working with a strategy of saying, okay, the entire UN is working on the Sustainable Development Goals. Let's look and see what's not being done. Let's look and see which goals are oversubscribed, if you will. Like any event with human beings involved, there's a herding influence. There's an awful lot of interest in gender equality. A lot of companies will, particularly the democracies, will talk about gender equality. And other more difficult problems, like cleaning up the ocean, have less money, less talent, less support coming after them. There is a huge opportunity in the range of activities there. And we said, how can we figure out what's not being done, raise special purpose financing vehicles for that, focus that money on that, and get things started. We view ourselves as an and effort, not an or effort. Most organizations see themselves as competing with other people. We would love to have dozens of people pop up and work on, for example, the ocean. We think that the more the merrier, but we want to be able to focus resources, particularly from family offices and pension funds and insurance companies, who have, insurance companies particularly interesting in family funds, interesting because they can have a long-term horizon. So we're particularly interested in, I'll give you two examples that we're working on right now. We have the ability to run a general fund, but we have two special initiatives. One is to finance 6,000 electric buses so we can get rid of the diesel pollution in Mexico City and perhaps in Istanbul and maybe in one of the cities in Argentina. There are other groups financing electric buses. We welcome that. We want to be supplemental to that. We're not trying to compete with them. We just want to put more money against that problem. The second project we have, and by the way, finding out how to get a return on money on buses is pretty straightforward. You buy them with the money that's put up front. You lease them to the cities. You get a share of the tolls in the fare box. You have a contract over a long period of time to recover the cost, and you can probably predict a return that works for investors who want to participate in good causes, but who need a return of some type. The second one I want to tell you about is a little more interesting and a little more difficult, And I think we've got a clever way of dealing with it. Did you know that there used to be about 1 trillion trees more in the world than there are now? About 1 trillion trees have been cut down for agriculture and for homes, but mainly for agriculture. So Roland Schatz, who is the managing director of UNGSII, challenged us and said, can we plant 1 trillion trees? That's a big number. I gave a talk like this and said 1 billion, and he corrected me from the floor. He said, no, we've got to have a higher goal. We may not make it, but we have to have the highest goal. So we were trying to get a special purpose vehicle funded that would start there, and there are lots of people planting trees around the world. The first effort we're making is to catalog some of that so we can not be competing but be complementing. We've got family offices, we've got pension funds, we've got the World Bank having this conversation. We've got some insurance companies that are interested, and we want to figure out how to supplement what's already going on in tree planting, the lungs of the earth, as we heard earlier. We want to supplement the existing efforts and plant trees, lots and lots and lots of trees. So, Bart, I really appreciate your drawing attention to these efforts and giving me a chance to talk about them, because the Sustainable Development Goals themselves are asking mankind to up its game. But these specifics, like planting a lot of trees or getting a lot of diesel buses off the road, are tangible enough and local enough and imposing enough for people to get their head around. Thank you very much for having me.
Al Berkeley is probably the only guy I know who can go to a fabulous Scotch tasting, which is all paired with fine foods in the Bank of America Tower, looking over the final sunset, and there's this beautiful single malt splayed wide before him, and he says, well, yes, the Scotch is nice, but what I really enjoyed was the people. And that's Al. Al sort of revels in community, and the other thing I love about him is that unlike most money guys, you know the money guys who go into a St. Vitus spasm at an eighth of a point shift in the market, Al has the calm confidence of a Christian with 4 aces. And I think it's because he is, when you listen to him talk, you don't hear the tips in the markets, the fluctuations. What you really hear is about Gentag doing this company that's making that happen, his own personal investments and what he cares for. And that is just one sign of what I see as very admirable. Al, would you come up?